On the 7th of July, 2018, on the slopes of K2, the second highest and perhaps the most dangerous mountain on the planet, a man loses his footing and falls. His name is Serge Dessureault, a highly experienced climber and firefighter, cautious to the extreme, the kind of man who calculates every single step. The worst is already behind him. He's simply heading back down a route he knows well. And then suddenly, he dies on a flat, easy stretch, right in front of a friend, yet in a way that leaves no one able to understand what actually caused the fall. What happened on that wall? To make sense of it, we have to go back to the beginning, to a tiny village deep in the forests of Quebec, the Lanaudière region, a land of cold lakes in northern Quebec. Here, in Saint-Michel-de-Saint, in 1964, a boy named Serge Dessureault is born. He grows up on Chagnon Street, in a big, noisy crowd of children, where you have to fight for your own place in the sun. His childhood is anything but easy. He loses his father early, and he has to grow up faster than he'd like. He finds his footing in the simplest thing he has, his own 2 legs. Running becomes a way to cope with whatever is pressing down on him from the inside. Serge runs his first marathon while he's still a teenager, when his peers are barely testing themselves on short school distances. 42 kilometers demand not so much talent as stubbornness. And stubbornness is something he has in abundance from the very start. Over the years, that stubbornness turns into results. By the age of 30, his personal best in the marathon is around 2 hours and 38 minutes, a level many amateurs chase their entire lives and never reach. The long distance teaches him one thing: to endure and not to stop at the moment when the body is already begging you to. A brutal physical load goes from being a rare ordeal to an almost daily need, something without which he doesn't feel like himself. He builds his whole adult life around the same thing, around the body and around motion. At the University of Montreal, Dessureault earns a degree in physical education, and it's here that his life takes an important turn. He meets Marie-Josée Normand, a fellow physical education graduate. She'll become his wife and his companion in all his future ventures. And there will be plenty of ventures. Even in those early years, it's clear what he's made of. It isn't enough for him just to stay in shape. He needs to keep feeling for his own limit and looking beyond it. To him, difficulty isn't an obstacle to be carefully avoided, but a task to be endured and pushed straight through, all the way to the end. And so, the Quebec boy with the hard childhood grows into a man with one simple rule for the decades ahead. Almost any barrier can be overcome if you have enough discipline and endurance. That endurance is something Serge Dessureault turns into a profession early on. On the 3rd of July, 1990, he joins the Montreal Fire Service, and he stays loyal to that work for decades. In time, he rises to the rank of captain and takes charge of one of the busiest stations in the heart of the city. Quiet shifts are almost unheard of here. By his own account, the station answers around 3,800 calls a year, on average 11 every single day. Fires, accidents, other people's misfortune. That's his everyday work, and making fast decisions under pressure is routine. His colleagues know Captain Dessureault as a man who keeps a cool head in a crisis. But even a rescuer's packed schedule isn't enough for him. He spends his days off on the harshest races on the planet. Twice, Dessureault takes on the Marathon des Sables, an 8-day run of nearly 230 kilometers across the scorching sands of the Moroccan Sahara, where each competitor carries all their own gear and food for the entire distance on their back. In one of these races, he finishes 48th out of nearly 600 rivals. Others train for years to achieve a result like that. And that's far from all. He completes the Eco Challenge in Patagonia and the grueling multidiscipline Ruta de los Conquistadores in Costa Rica. 6 times he lines up at the start of the World Police and Fire Games, a competition for people in his profession from all over the world. The list of challenges grows year after year, and each new one is tougher than the last. He simply doesn't know how to stop. After every big ordeal, he assures himself that he's had enough, and almost immediately feels the lack of it again. Without a serious physical load, he just can't sit still. He learns the price of a life like this firsthand. After one of the desert races, Dessureault comes home with a severe infection that nearly costs him his life. But even that is only a brief pause for him. He recovers and goes looking again for a new way to test himself. Risk and working at the edge of his strength stop being anything exceptional for him. They become the familiar, almost everyday backdrop of his life. Around 2004, this hunger for the limit finds a new shape. Dessureault lifts his gaze from running tracks and sand dunes to real mountains, and gradually goes from being a marathoner and a racer to a mountaineer. Everything here is different from the competitions he's used to. Instead of heat, cold. Instead of speed, a slow, draining gain of altitude. Instead of a flat distance, the vertical. It's exactly this novelties and difficulty that draw him in. He enters this new world not alone, but together with his friend Maurice Beauséjour, a man with whom he'll later share more than one summit. Dessureault approaches the task with the same thoroughness he brings to everything else. On the advice of experienced climbers, he doesn't rush straight at something great. Instead, he methodically builds experience on training peaks first, and always with guides. The path of his apprenticeship looks like a journey across the most famous heights of different continents. Mont Blanc, the highest point of the Alps, Elbrus in the Caucasus, Kilimanjaro in Africa, Aconcagua, the highest peak of the Americas. Each of these mountains in its own way tests whether he's ready to go further. That very first school matters especially to him. On Mont Blanc, a team of guides spends a week showing him the basics: how to move, how to work with a rope, how to rappel, and what to watch for on a steep wall. On these mountains, Dessureault learns what neither a treadmill nor a desert can teach. He learns to work at high altitude, where there's almost half as much air and every step is a struggle. He gets used to moving rope together, when your own life is literally tied by a rope to your partner's, and to long hours in the freezing cold. The mountain instills in him a new kind of patience, slow, cold, calculating. With every summit he climbs, his eyes lift higher. What began as just another physical test turns into a passion that will define the rest of his life. And soon, Dessureault sets himself a goal there's simply nothing higher than on Earth, the highest point of the planet, Everest. He reaches that goal. On the 15th of May, 2007, Serge Dessureault stands on the summit of Everest, at an altitude of around 8,850 meters. There's almost 3 times less air here than at sea level. The body works at its absolute limit, and you can linger for only a few hours. To get here, you need weeks on the slope and a slow, stubborn process of the body adapting to altitude. Dessureault doesn't take the easiest way up. He chooses the northern, Tibetan side of the mountain, less traveled and technically harder than the popular Nepalese route. Here, you have to fight your way through steep rock bands that drain both your strength and your time. By way of this wall, Dessureault becomes the first Quebecer in history to reach the top of the world. He isn't alone on the summit. About half an hour later, his partner Maurice Beauséjour climbs up to join him. Beauséjour is 10 years older than Dessureault, and with this climb, he writes his own name into history too, becoming the oldest Quebecer ever to stand on Everest. The 30 minutes between them is a trifle next to everything they planned and went through together. Between the two of them, they close out an entire chapter. Their ascent is presented as the first Quebec expedition to climb Everest by the North Wall. When you remember that, just a few years earlier, these two were only learning the basics on training peaks. The journey from beginners to the highest point on the planet looks almost unbelievable. And they pulled it off, not through recklessness, but through cold calculation and stubborn preparation. There's a very personal detail on that summit too. In the photo from the highest point on the planet, Dessureault proudly unfurls the patches of his fire service. He carried them all the way up with him. That gesture is him in a nutshell, a man for whom the service and the mountains were always 2 sides of one life. In that moment, the great dream of his life is fulfilled. It seems there's nothing higher left to wish for. He's achieved exactly what he endured, trained, and risked so much for over so many years. But every great dream has its price. Returning from the top of the world, Dessureault unexpectedly sinks into a hard period, what those close to him would later describe as a genuine slump. The mountain he'd spent years climbing toward has been conquered, and in its place a strange emptiness opens up inside him. The goal that had kept him taut for so many years vanishes, and with it goes his familiar sense of grounding. It's the familiar trap of great achievements. The higher the summit, the deeper the slump can be. A slump that sometimes sets in right after the triumph. From the outside, it looks like exactly the opposite. In these very years, Dessureault's fame only grows. In 2015, he becomes one of the central figures of the television series Alert 5, which spends a full season following the daily lives of Montreal firefighters. People recognize his face on the street. He's called, perhaps, the most famous firefighter in Quebec. But public recognition doesn't fill what has emptied out inside. To cope, he leans on what he does best: preparation and control. According to those close to him, Dessureault genuinely believes that careful training and calculation will be enough to master even what can't be mastered. There's a flip side to that belief, something like a Superman complex, the feeling that risk will always back down before a good preparation. That mindset had helped him get his way more than once, but in the mountains, believing in total control is dangerous in itself. And then he finds something that gives him direction again. In 2014, the year he turns 50, Dessureault sets himself a new, great goal. He wants to become the first Quebecer to climb both Everest and K2. For a climber of his level, that would be the summit not only of a mountain, but of an entire life, an achievement none of his countrymen had ever managed. But K2 is a mountain of an entirely different order. Far fewer people have stood on its summit than on Everest's. And for a long time, for every 4 successful ascents here, there was 1 death. For that fierce nature, K2 has long been nicknamed the Savage. This is the peak Dessureault gradually turns into his own private, almost all-consuming obsession. In 2016, Dessureault sets out for K2 for the first time and tests himself where, until then, he had only dreamed of being. He climbs the Abruzzi Spur, the classic route most climbers take, long, steep, and unforgiving of mistakes. With him on the team is another Quebec climber, Benoit Lamoureux. Both are well prepared and full of resolve, but from the very first days the mountain makes it clear that it sets the rules here, and there's no point arguing. And that's just how it goes. They run into powerful storms on the route, and conditions turn dangerous. Before pushing up to Camp 3, Dessureault and Lamoureux make a decision that will later prove fateful. They don't rush upward. Instead, they decide to wait, to let the fresh snow settle so the slope becomes safer. For 2 ambitious men who have come this far for the summit, it's a very hard choice. To voluntarily freeze in place almost within reach of the goal and hand the initiative to the mountain. And it's that caution that saves their lives. While they wait below, avalanches come down off the slope and sweep away the very Camp 3 they had planned to climb up to. An avalanche on a mountain like this comes down in a matter of seconds and spares nothing in its path. Had Dessureault and his partner been up there on the original schedule, this story would have ended back in 2016. In an instant, the mountain shows just how thin the line is here between patience and disaster. After something like that, there's no going on. Dessureault and his partner turn back, and the first round goes to K2. But here's what matters. Dessureault walks off the mountain alive precisely because he showed prudence at the right moment, not stubbornness. Many strong climbers die for exactly the opposite reason, because they can't force themselves to turn back once the mountain has already said no. In 2016, Dessureault could, and yet the defeat doesn't cool him off. On the contrary, it sharpens his resolve. The goal hasn't gone anywhere. It's still waiting for him up there, and now he knows this mountain a little better than before. Dessureault heads home with one stubborn thought. He will come back here, no matter what. 2 years pass. In 2018, he returns to the mountain, but this time at the head of his own small team. Beside him are 2 countrymen, his old Everest partner, Maurice Beauséjour, and the experienced climber, Nathalie Fortin. For Dessureault, this is no longer just a climb, but his expedition, his vision, and his responsibility. The goal he's spent several years working toward is finally within reach again. Their Quebec trio is part of a larger international expedition called K2 and Broad Peak, with 9 people in all. This time, Dessureault deliberately puts his trust in Pakistani support, local high-altitude porters and guides for whom this mountain is home. He'd seen how they work and had felt their devotion to the summit. As always, he thinks through every little detail, leaving no room for chance wherever chance can be removed. He approaches the risk in a pointedly sober and methodical way. The mountain has a bad reputation, he says before leaving, but we're not about to play Russian roulette. He understands perfectly well where he's going. K2, Dessureault explains, is almost solid vertical, real technical mountaineering from the very first step, unlike the gentler, more well-trodden Everest. There are no easy stretches here where you can catch your breath. And he speaks with particular care about the descent. Dessureault notes more than once that many accidents in the mountains happen precisely on the way down, on the return, when exhausted people relax and lose their vigilance. Reaching the summit isn't success yet. Success, he repeats again and again, is getting back down and coming home alive. He says those words like a principle he intends to live by this time too. That's how the people who know him well see him too. Later, his colleagues would put it simply. Serge didn't take risks. He thought about safety and about coming home before he ever took his first step upward. It's with this mindset that Dessureault approaches the greatest climb of his life. In early July, the decisive push begins. This isn't the summit assault yet, but acclimatization, a mandatory routine stage during which the body slowly adjusts to the thin air, and the climbers go higher and come back down again, preparing themselves for the final attempt. On the 5th of July, Dessureault and Quebecer set out upward toward Camp 3 and spend their first night at Camp 1. So far, everything is going calmly and exactly to plan. But from this point on, the mountain begins to take his team away from him, one by one. Already on the next stretch, on the climb up to Camp 2, Quebecer's hands freeze. At this altitude, frostbite is a serious threat. You can't go any higher with it. Quebecer makes the hard but only sensible decision and turns back toward Camp 1. And so, at the most critical moment, Dessureault loses his most experienced and closest partner. From here, into the most dangerous part of the route, Dessureault and Nathalie Fortin go on alone, just the two of them. On a mountain like K2, every member who drops out means fewer hands, less backup, and fewer chances to help if something suddenly goes wrong. Two people make everything harder. And yet they keep climbing, steadily, step by step, without forcing the pace. And by evening, they reach Camp 2 at an altitude of around 6,700 meters. Here, in a cramped tent on the steep slope, they spend the night. In the evening, someone notices something unusual about Dessureault. Always composed and tireless, this time he looks noticeably worn out and barely touches his food. For a man of his toughness, used to the heaviest loads, it's a complete trifle. Something that, under any other circumstances, no one would have given a second thought. Fatigue after a long day at high altitude is an ordinary thing. The next morning, the 7th of July, the hardest part seems to be behind them. The acclimatization push is nearly complete, the grueling work of the climb is done, and all that's left for the team, it would seem, is the simplest and most familiar part, to head back down to base camp, where rest awaits them before the next attempt. Except that on K2, the road to rest is itself deadly dangerous. For most of the way, you have to rappel, descend along ropes fixed to the slope in advance, clipping into them with a special device, and slowly letting yourself down along the wall. Slow, monotonous work that demands constant attention to every movement and every anchor point. Beneath your feet, hundreds of meters of empty space. That morning, the wind is blowing, but visibility is good, and nothing hints at trouble. The conditions are completely ordinary for this brutal mountain. Dessureault starts the descent first, about half an hour ahead of Nathalie Fortin. There's nothing unusual about that. An experienced climber goes ahead along a familiar route, one the team had already covered the day before on the way up. Ahead lies just a few hours of careful work downward. And then, at around 25 minutes past 9 in the morning, local time, in Quebec, it's still the dead of night at that moment, the irreparable happens. Somewhere on a steep section of the wall, Dessureault falls. On the nearly sheer slope, it all unfolds in a matter of moments. From below, from Camp 1, Maurice Quebecer is climbing up to meet those coming down, and he hears a cry. He raises his head, and in the figure sliding down the wall, he recognizes his friend's mitten. There's no doubt, it's Serge. But here's what matters. Quebecer sees the fall itself, yet the very start of it, the instant that proved fatal for Dessureault, no one sees at all. What exactly happened in the second before the fall remains a mystery that morning, and perhaps the most inexplicable thing. All of this happens not even on a difficult or dangerous stretch of the route, in a place where, for a man this experienced, you'd think nothing posed a threat. For everyone who knew Dessureault, there's something especially cruel in what happened. He dies not in a storm and not on the summit assault, but on a quiet, clear morning, on the most ordinary part of the way down. The thing he'd been working toward for so many years is cut off in one short instant. Higher up the wall, Natalie 14 still knows nothing of any of this. She set off on the descent later than her partner and doesn't yet even suspect what has happened down there. Alone on the steep slope, Fortin calmly starts down after him, along the very same fixed ropes that Dessureault had just been using. She moves carefully and with full focus, just as she was taught, with no idea that a few ropes below her, everything has already changed. On one of the sections, she makes a horrifying discovery. The very first rope she's about to descend on has been cut. On a sheer wall, here's what that means. The fixed rope is the main, and sometimes the only, support. The thing a climber literally entrusts their life to. And that support suddenly turns out to be severed. For a climber, there's almost nothing more unnatural and terrifying. With enormous effort, Fortin holds the stub of rope in her descender, a so-called figure 8, a simple metal device you thread the rope through when rappelling. For a few seconds, her own life depends on a single precise movement. In those very seconds, another experienced climber is making her way up toward her from below. Sophie Laveau. Over the radio comes confirmation of what Fortin is already afraid to say out loud. It was Serge Dessureault who fell. Those words leave not a shred of hope. What began as an ordinary descent has, in a single morning, turned into the worst thing that could possibly have happened. And the rest of the way down, Fortin will have to make alone, already knowing what has happened to her partner. Laveau doesn't leave her alone. She helps Fortin pull herself together, checks her carabiners and her whole safety system, and slowly, step by step, leads her down the wall. Without that composure and that help, descending in such a state would have been nearly impossible. And so, in the deepest shock, Natalie Fortin makes it down off the mountain alive. But she carries down with her not only what she's been through, but also what she saw with her own eyes up there, on the fixed lines. And below, at the foot of the wall, another road begins, no less harrowing, now with the body. Dessureault is found by his old friend Maurice Beauséjour and a local high-altitude porter. The very same Beauséjour who once stood with Dessureault on the summit of Everest now finds him at the foot of K2. Together, they gently prepare the dead man for transport and begin the long, exhausting descent toward advanced base camp. Just how great the drop in altitude was on this stretch is impossible to say precisely. By some estimates, it's a matter of more than 1,000 meters. By others, around 1,500. The sources disagree on the figures, just as they will later disagree on much else. But either way, it's an enormous, almost sheer height. After that comes an agonizing wait. K2 is one of the most remote and inaccessible peaks in the world. There are no villages here, no doctors a few hours walk away as there are on Everest, and when disaster strikes, there's almost nothing to help you quickly. For 2 full days on the mountain, they have to wait for helicopters. The weather and the logistics in this remote region dictate their own terms. At last, the evacuation begins. A helicopter first brings them down to Camp 1, and from there to the Pakistani city of Skardu. On the 11th of July, the surviving members of the expedition return home, to Quebec, without their leader and friend, the man they'd set out with full of hope. And on the 15th of July, Dessureault's body is brought home as well. Managing this in a foreign country, thousands of kilometers from home, is possible largely thanks to the Pakistani company Summit Karakoram and a liaison officer, who take on the endless formalities and arrangements. The remaining team members wind down the expedition. No one can find it in themselves to continue the climb after what has happened. So ends Dessureault's second attempt on K2, a mountain he came back to twice, and which twice refused to let him pass. The plan he had lived for over the last several years, to become the first Quebecer to climb both Everest and K2, remains unrealized. He comes home not as the triumphant figure he'd dreamed of being, but as a question without an answer. Officially, the cause of the fall can't be established. Too few witnesses, too fast for anyone to grasp. At high altitude, where there are almost never direct witnesses to the moment itself, such things are hard to establish with any certainty. The Alpine Club of Pakistan openly admits that it isn't immediately clear how, exactly, Dessureault fell, and it doesn't get any clearer with time. Instead of one sharp picture, several contradictory versions emerge. Garrett Madison, an experienced guide whose team was working on the mountain in those same days, relays from the Sherpas who were nearby, the possibility that during the descent an old fixed rope snapped. Fixed lines on routes like these often hang for several seasons, bleached by the sun and frayed by the wind. But Madison himself immediately qualifies it. The real cause is unclear to him, and this is only a guess that reached him secondhand. Natalie Fortin, though, who was descending right behind and saw it all with her own eyes, disagrees with that version. Her account is one of the few direct testimonies about what was on that wall. According to her, both ropes on that section were new, installed this very season, meaning it wasn't a matter of old, worn-out equipment, and, crucially, one of those ropes turned out not to be frayed through, but cut. What could have severed it on a sheer wall and how remains a mystery. There's a third version, too. Another time, Madison blames a cheap, unreliable fixed rope, one he distrusted so much that his own team had preemptively re-rigged the section between Camp 1 and Camp 2 with a stronger line. But for all the variety of theories, one thing is worth singling out. Not a single version claims that an anchor station or an anchor point failed. It's always a matter of the rope. And so, the central mystery of this story takes shape. An old rope or a new one that was damaged. Someone else's mistake, a defect in the equipment, or a fatal stroke of chance. No one has the answer, and after all these years, it's unlikely ever to surface. What it was that failed the most careful and methodical man on that wall, no one knows. And, perhaps, no one ever will. While the mountain keeps its secret, his world does not stay silent. News of Dessureault's death spreads across Quebec in an instant. Within a few hours, the story is shared more than 1,000 times. For many, it's a blow. This is one of the most famous and beloved firefighters in the province, a man whose adventures people had followed for years. The death of someone who seemed almost invincible shakes both his colleagues and complete strangers. People come to say goodbye from all sides. Official statements come from the director of the Montreal Fire Service and the president of the Firefighters Union. Both speak of Dessureault as a man devoted with all his heart to his work. The mayor of the city, Valérie Plante, offers her condolences to the family. Firefighters from other cities, for whom he had become one of their own, honor the captain's memory. And words of support arrive even from the vast, usually reserved world of high-altitude mountaineering. From those who know the price of this mountain. But longest and warmest of all, he's remembered where it all began. His native Saint-Michel-de-Saint does not forget its famous sun, even though Dessureault had left the village long ago. 3 years later, on the 28th of August, 2021, the little town names its recreation park after him, so that the name of Serge Dessureault would forever remain near the home from which he once set out on the long road to the highest peaks in the world. Around that same time, his family speaks openly for the first time too. Years after the tragedy, those close to him finally find the strength to talk about what they had to live through, about the sudden loss, the long grief, and about who Serge really was, far from the cameras and the mountain summits. Serge Dessureault is remembered not only for his climbs, but for the kind of man he was, a solid, grounded person who, both in the fire and on the wall, always chose calculation over bravado. Twice he climbed to the foot of K2, twice he challenged the most dangerous mountain on the planet, and his name is now forever bound to it, to the mountain that never let him go.